This program is brought to you by Emory University.
So we're celebrating the opening of Salman Rushdie's archive this weekend. It's a wonderful literary and political event, and so many of us are aware it doesn't seem so very long ago that none of us were quite sure whether he or the archive would emerge into daylight. And since for today the only subject is love, I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about your friendship with him. I've noticed in reading through some of your work, both in print and on television, that he appears in a great deal of it. And I've also noticed the affection and respect with which you write and speak about him. So can you tell me a little bit about how you met and a little bit about the course of your friendship?
Yes.
I can.
Lovingly, I can. Well, I knew him in a way before I met him because everyone of my age had read his magnificent novels about the simultaneous liberation of and amputation of his homeland. The price of its freedom was a mutilation, a partition. Subject which interested me anyway, but I'd never seen verbalized or fictionalized in that way before. And so we actually met in a place in London called Notting Hill, now made famous by the revolting winsomeness of Hugh Grant.
Hugh Grant's movies, right.
But actually better understood as the great HQ of the Caribbean population of the United Kingdom. And there's an annual carnival where there's a steel band competition and various other less Hugh Grant-like events. Right. And at a rather funky do, I met the future Sir Salman Rushdie, looking less like a person liable to be knighted by Her Majesty the Queen than anyone I'd ever seen. And we babbled on. We had a slight disagreement even then about, again, about India, about partition. He hadn't particularly liked Paul Scott's novels, and even less, I think, had liked their dramatization on Masterpiece Theatre. And I thought they were better than that, and we had a little disagreement there. But I could tell that he was a real original. And when I asked him, I shouldn't take too long over this, but I asked him later for a little blurb for a collection of essays I'd written, which included the Paul Scott one, which included a slight attack on him. And the blurb said that, with the exception of some unpardonable foolishness on pages 1 to... This is quite a good book, and so forth. And then, I guess we can't not do this, so we might as well do it economically. Yep. Anyone here who thinks what they were thinking on 9/11 should try and think what I was thinking on St. Valentine's Day, 1989. In other words, a confrontation between, a direct one, a very violent one, between everything I hated, because I think hate has to take part in this conversation,
absolutely.
Versus everything I loved. And if you want, I'll tell you which the two things are.
You must.
Well, under hate, boringness, and its counterparts, religious intolerance, literal-mindedness, the view that you only need one book. And not only that, you can only read it one way. The unbearable tedium of that. Backed up by ill-tempered authoritarianism. The open offer of money in his own name by a theocratic fanatic to suborn murder of someone who's writing a novel in another country, who wasn't even an Iranian citizen. I mean, that, I thought, okay, in every generation there is a defined confrontation for those who favor free expression over those who don't, and this is the one for our time. Right. By the way, almost all the famous confrontations over this in history have been on the matter of blasphemy, ever since the trial of Socrates, or Galileo. Go through it, you'll find all these confrontations are to do with whether or not you can use Holy Writ for literary purposes. So, I feel I hadn't lived this long not to know a confrontation when I saw, and I thought, not only is this something that calls upon me in any case, but it involves defending someone who's become a friend and who is a literary genius. So I thought of it in a way, he couldn't have said this, I thought of it as almost a great opportunity, almost as if I was lucky, a sentiment he couldn't very easily
Readily
echo.
agree with, yes.
I forgot to say which bits I loved.
I was waiting for that.
Well, in contradistinction to the literal mind, the Aztec face of the stupid certain person, the person who already has all the information they need. Irony, without which life is impossible. Yeah. Irony is the gin in the Campari. It's the cream in the coffee. It's not thinkable to do anything without it. Irony, love of literature and language for its own sake, explorations of same across frontiers and boundaries, the right of the individual to conduct literary activities in his or her own way and for their own sake, freedom of the press, the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, very important amendment, rightly the first one. Other things like that, worth fighting for and worth saying they command one's love as well as one's respect.
I'm struck by two things. The first is the way you make the connection between freedom and mutilation in your earlier comments. One of my most compelling memories of Salman was when he was under fatwa, and Bard College, where I used to teach, invited him to be the graduation speaker. And no one knew who the graduation speaker was going to be. And it was a month of quiet and murmuring amongst all the undergraduates. And there was lots of speculation, and it was this wonderful educational moment where the students had to figure out who needed to be so quiet. And then they were all gathered in the graduation dinner, and Salman walked in quietly, completely unobtrusively, and the whole place lifted up and burst into applause. And it was a really interesting moment for everybody. Because one of the things he mentioned when we hosted him, he was still under fatwa, was the price for the fatwa. Of course it was fear, of course it was anxiety, but it was most importantly boredom. That much of his time under fatwa was boring.
Well, I mentioned this last night in a little toast I gave, but I guess I could share it with them.
Sure.
He did tell me once that he was not really afraid of the death squads.
Right.
So much though they had killed, and don't forget, they'd killed one of his translators, they'd very badly injured and mutilated another, and shot another one, a Norwegian, William Nygaard, 3 times with a high-velocity rifle in the back and left him in the snow, thinking he was dead. So it was no joke. But he said he was more worried that the experience of having to be constantly on guard, moved around, just distracted, replying to abusive nonsense written about him in particularly the English press and elsewhere, would kill his ability to write. He was afraid they'd murder that.
Right. Right.
So that's why one of my favorite novels of his is The Moor's Last Sigh, El Ultimo Suspiro del Moro, which, as well as being a great tribute to the cultural synthesis between Islam and the West that took place in Andalusia, quite a generous subject in the view of the Turks, was also marvelously, almost musically written, and showed no, they couldn't kill him as a writer either.
And I'm also struck
So
by...
fuck them, as it were.
Right.
If the expression may be allowed.
Yes, absolutely. I'm also struck by what you said about irony. I was in a conversation with a theologian once who, in thinking about postmodern understandings of irony and so on, said there are very many things he might give his life up for, but irony was not one of them. And my response was, probably the first thing I would give up my life for would be irony.
Don't you think that's a bit literal?
Yes, it is indeed a bit literal.
On your part?
Yes, of course.
Still, I admire the sentiment.
Yes, absolutely. So the other thing I've been looking at in terms of your writing is the unacknowledged legislation, that wonderful collection of essays. And you talk a little bit about the line itself, which of course is taken from Shelley, and we wouldn't even know that if it weren't for Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, 18 years, publishing it, getting it in print after his death. It seems to me that both you and Salman share a certain conviction that the best writing, as you put it, moves around the furniture in one's mind. And you talk about the war poems. Wilfred Owen did this for you quite early on and made you question everything you thought about order and patriotism and tradition. So
more like turning over all the cargo in your hold. Than just moving the furniture.
Right.
Anyone can survive a furniture move. It's when you feel the cargo shifting in your interior that you feel, oh boy. That was a real exposure to literature I just had.
So is there anyone, I mean, I know you've taught at the New School, you've taught at Berkeley, and you've worked with students, and is there anyone writing today who you would suggest for young readers here who might have had the same effect on these readers as Owen did for you?
Well, I think they should read Wilfred Owen. And in particular, they should read Dulce et Decorum Est, the poem that first arrested me, which became part of the basis for Benjamin Britten's War Requiem. There's no reason not to read that. I mean, the First World War was as remote to me as it probably is to anyone here when I read it. It will always be not something outside my own generation experience. But if you don't know what happened in the First World War, you don't know why we are still in the crisis of civilization to which it led, and which is still going on. And the poetry of that war is the especially sensitive register of what a tragedy it was. I can, in fact, recite Dulce et Decorum Est, but I don't know if we have time. The problem is that I still usually can't do it without becoming slightly moist, which might be embarrassing all round. But it's
absolutely up
anyone
to you.
All right, I will do it.
I think you should.
Why not?
Why not?
Okay. You have to picture the trenches and in the Western Front, and a young lieutenant from the Midlands. This is bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and towards our distant rests began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, blood-shod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf, even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5-9s that dropped behind. Gas. Gas. Quick boys. An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone there was shouting out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime, deep through the dark green panes and thin green light, as under a green sea, I watched him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If, in some smothering dream, you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil's, sick of sin. If you could hear, at every jolt, the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not say, with such high zest, to children, ardent for some desperate glory, that old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori.
Thank you.
So when someone says to me I should be reading, I don't know, it might be, no offense to Jonathan Franzen, I think to myself, I wonder if in a year anyone will be asking me that. And by the way, I haven't recently reread Scenes from Clerical Life or Wilfred Owen, and I might be doing better to stay with the gold standard.
Well, this is very much connected to my next area of thinking, and that is, you write in several places that the best writing is by nature political, not because it is overtly politicized nor covertly politicized, but because it's concerned with the honesty and integrity of public life. And I was very moved by that, and partly it's because you write that so often it is individual pens which create the moral space for a true argument. And I'm not sure everyone here has read your work on Thomas Paine or Thomas Jefferson, but it would be good to hear a little bit more about how those two figures in particular have created that moral space for a true argument.
Well, the real reason why I realized I was becoming, and had in effect become, but wanted to become formally as well an American citizen, it was a realization that took a while to dawn on me, is that as well as America being the great subject for a writer, which is why I originally thought I wanted to move here, it is also itself a work in progress, and founded on certain documents and with certain flourishes of writing, which are also, amazingly, subject to revision, such as the US Constitution and so forth. So that rather exciting to be able to take part in this process of composition, shall I say. And the two people who best expressed that were Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Paine's pamphlets calling for an end to the British monarchy in North America are very beautifully written and make him, in the eyes of many historians, the moral author of the Declaration of Independence. He was certainly at Jefferson's elbow, so to speak, what's being written. And the Declaration itself is, along with, I think, the King James Bible, the only useful work ever done by a committee of a literary kind.
It was written by committee.
Unless there were 4 Homers, where the jury is still out. I firmly believe there was only one Shakespeare. I wouldn't trust anyone who didn't believe that. It's possible the Odyssey is multiple. So, and all of these ideas are taken from the very height of the European Enlightenment. It really is true. Gatsby was right, or Fitzgerald was right. You meet a new country that finally stands equal to the human capacity for wonder. And you can start again. And you're starting again with John Locke, and Thomas Paine, and David Hume, and the first generation also where printing presses make ideas of this kind possible for ordinary, as we dare to call them, ordinary people to read. The self-educated artisan becomes an actor on the stage of history.
I'm also reminded of what you say about Jefferson in relationship to Orwell. In your last, Orwell is also one of your heroes, and you write about...
I try not to have heroes, but I mean, I know what you mean.
Close as possible, yes. And the fact that he's still understood, intriguingly, as a futuristic thinker, even after 1984 is come and gone as a date. And what's interesting in your recent essay about Orwell, you argue that Orwell motivates us to keep the written and the spoken word together, which I think is a beautiful, for an educator, it's a beautiful sentiment, thought, never mind sentiment. And you argue why that is the case is because they shouldn't be too far apart, because in totalitarian regimes, there's a tendency to create a spoken language in which certain thoughts, such as thoughts about freedom, are impossible to articulate in writing, and vice versa, right? Mutatis mutandis. And it seems also characteristic of Salman's work that there's this connection between the written and the spoken word, very much part of the satirical critiques of religion and society that both of you have written, you in critical essays, him in fiction. And this wonderful phrase that Jefferson, in Newspeak, right? Jefferson could not have written what he wrote. Right?
That's a fantastically beautiful question, by the way, and very capacious. I'm going to have to try and remember all of it.
Go.
No, I'll tell you, I'll have to do it in reverse order slightly, because I now know what I'm going to say about Jefferson, Orwell, and Paine. But concerning this question of writing as a form of conversation or speech, I say to my students, look, cheer up. If you can talk, you can write. They do cheer up. Then I say to them...
They start to write.
Then I say to them, okay, which of your friends in this class do you really enjoy talking to, hearing? Who speaks well, any of you? I say, at least when you write something, read it out loud, either back to yourself or maybe get a trusted friend or lover to do it. You'll be horrified. But at least you can't put, at least when you've written something, you can't put the word like in every 5 minutes like you do now. So there are some mistakes you can't make that way, just as there are some mistakes you can only make in writing. So I say, no, which of you can really talk? And they can't, they cannot. So I cast them down all over again. When I've really broken them to my will, then I can start teaching them to write.
But you're speaking of
now,
freedom.
with Salman, he stayed with me once at Thanksgiving. It was when he was still on the run, and we were trying to get him in to see Bill Clinton, which we did, in fact, succeed in getting at a critical time in the fight. And I had leisure time with him because, unfortunately, our apartment had to be in a sort of armed camp for a while. And I was writing a piece of Vanity Fair on black and white. Every now and then we do a black and white. And we were commemorating Truman Capote's famous black and white ball. And they said to me, Hitch, you're supposed to be able to write about anything. Can you just do 3,000 words on black and white? And I said, I'm sure I can, but I didn't know quite how I was going to do it. And I said, Salman, look, while I've got you, before dinner, do you mind just free associating for a bit on black and white? And his eyes slightly hooded. Yeah, and for the next half hour, it wasn't free association at all. It was an extraordinarily well-organized, well-thought-out, unprompted spate of stuff. I didn't know before this that Shah Jahan, designer of the Taj Mahal, had wanted a black copy in black marble on the other side of a reflecting pool at Agra. Brilliant idea. Once you've got it, you can't lose it. I didn't know about Edward Muybridge's multiple black and white exposures of horses galloping and amazing work he did. It was as if I was listening to someone composing music, actually. I can't rival that, but I know that there must be a connection between his literary ability and his ability as a conversationalist and a speaker. And I think that, I sometimes think he's not even writing it down, he's almost transmitting it. Now, with Orwell, that's not true. Orwell was rather gruff in conversation and actually rather Anglo-Saxon on the page. I mean, it's one of the reasons it endures is it's quite simple. But on him and the revolution, the American Revolution, I've made another discovery since. Who here can tell me, rather, I should say, who can't tell me what is the opening line of 1984? Since there are no hands, I presume that means everyone can. Oh, you say you can't? Well, the hell with you then. The opening line of 1984 is the following. It was a bright, cold day in April, and all the clocks were striking 13. You know you're off to the races. April 13th is Jefferson's birthday. It's also mine, by the way. Although Jefferson was born before the old calendar changed, so he had two birthdays. He was actually born on the 2nd of April, had to switch it to the 13th. Often wonder what the astrologers did when they were born. I'm sure they managed to work it out somehow. John Adams said of the 13 colonies, the great problem of declaring the revolution will be to get all 13 clocks to strike at the same time. So I think I may be onto something here. Anyway, at the end of the novel, there's a dictionary of newspeak which shows the attempt essentially to purge the idea of freedom from the language so that it couldn't, there's no word, there's no, I don't mean no word, there's no syntax of liberty in which you could talk. To grind it out, grind all the Milton, all the Shelley, everything out of English. And in the dictionary, Orwell gives an instance of a sentence that could not be translated into newspeak. And guess what sentence is? It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. That, by the way, was put in by Franklin.
Interesting.
Yes, Franklin crucially firmed up Jefferson on this point. Jefferson said, we hold these truths to be, something like that, but Frank said, don't you think self-evident would go well there? They thought, yes.
Writing by committee, in other words.
Yeah, that's why committee writing is better than you think.
I think also what you're reminding me of is something very important that I know has come up in your recent writing, and that is the question of self-censorship and the effect of a kind of newspeak idea. I'm writing a book now on scholars of religion who, well-intended though they may be, have profoundly insulted the communities about which they're writing. You would like many of them. And one of the things that's so interesting about each of them is their narratives after this happens to them is there's a question of self-censorship that immediately comes in. And I think, therefore, thinking about the relationship between the written and the spoken word again, it's ways in which we imagine ourselves speaking something and yet we dare not write it. And that's what happens in self-censorship with so many writers.
Look, it's not unlike what I said earlier about all the classic test cases in history of free expression are to do with profanity. Or blasphemy, if you prefer. Socrates, Galileo. Galileo agreed to shut up, or at least to not say that his theory had any theological implications. The same cardinal, Cardinal Bellarmine, was the man who burned Giordano Bruno, by the way, who conducted that inquisition. Spinoza, after being excommunicated by his synagogue in Amsterdam, changed his name a bit, didn't put his name on anything he wrote, put a rose, a sub rosa symbol with the caute, caution motto on it. He wouldn't stop, but he had to write obscurely. Antonio Gramsci, in the Quaderni, the prison notebooks of Italy, he managed to write under Mussolini in prison, but he had to write often a very jargonized form so as not to reveal the full implications of what he meant by it. his project. So it goes. Now, these people were threatened with torture and death and worse, or both, or in different order. The wonderful salad of opportunities that could be offered to you by the clerics in those days. Yale University Press is threatened with no such thing.
Right.
But it doesn't have the nerve to publish a book on the Danish cartoons that has the cartoons reprinted in the book. And not only that, it doesn't understand the basic muscle and sinew of the English language, because in saying that we are going to take out the cartoons now from the book, it said because we're convinced that if we did not, we would be instigating violence. Now, it's a pity that Yale University Press doesn't know the meaning of the simple word instigate, which means you go out and sponsor it and try and make it happen. You try to incite it. They promote themselves from the passive to the active, whereas in fact they couldn't be more passive and more supine. So that was pretty easy. Without a shot being fired, not a shot being fired, a shot being threatened, the campus of Nathan Hale is running up the right flag. We surrender. You didn't ask us to, but in case you do, we already have. This is very common now across publishing, across the movies. It's all across my profession of journalism. Everyone's in full retreat. So though Salman survived brilliantly and his work did, anyone trying to be him now wouldn't get a publisher.
This is something, there's an Indian activist and writer, Purushottam Agarwal, who speaks very eloquently
about...
What
does that actually translate to?
The mighty human, the great person. That's what Purushottam means.
Indian names are always worth unpacking.
That's right. We were talking about this at lunch, about translating Indian names. He talks about that every author reserves the right to blaspheme, which I think is a wonderful way to put it. And he also speaks about the fact that he learned this from negotiating with a cowardly publisher.
Yes.
And most of the authors that I work with also talk and speak very, very clearly about whether they trust the publisher or not. So it's a very profound question.
Theodore Adorno, in his Minimum Moralia, his book of epigrams, says he's reflecting on the Hayes office, which the younger ones, if you won't remember, but used to be the office of religious vigilance and civic censorship in Hollywood. It was the one that said you couldn't have black and white characters in the same bed. Actually, you couldn't have male and female characters in the same. You had to show twin beds even if you showed a married person's home. All this stuff, and was a very oppressive Hayes office code for many decades. And Adorno said, his reflection was, it would be possible to make an aesthetically and artistically satisfying film that was in complete conformity with all the rules of the Hayes office, as long as there was no Hayes office.
Right.
So if you keep telling yourself, I'm of course free to say anything I like, but I better avoid the blasphemy business, don't think that it won't bleed back into everything that you're writing and offering to publishers. Don't think that you aren't doing the censor's work for him. Well, I mean, I don't have a day to live under the instructions of some mullah or rabbi or priest, and I'm not going to. And I've been inspired to say that by people much braver than myself. I think it's the least you can say. No, I don't owe them a thing. And I refuse to act as if I do. And I refuse to let them talk to me as if I owe it to them. And one more thing, we too have unalterable convictions. We too have principles we're willing to fight for, die for, kill for if you like, if you insist. Don't mistake our pluralism and our tolerance and our multiculturalism. Don't mistake that for weakness. We have convictions too and principles, and we can be offended.
Well,
we can be offended.
We have so much more to talk about, and I'm just seeing that we have to wrap up, but I wanted to ask you...
I hardly got my pants
I know,
off.
we just got started. I'm so sorry. I apologize. I'm working with our publishers over there.
Well, tell them they don't understand foreplay.
I think you just did.
Something about you makes me this way.
All right. My final question is actually quite a serious one.
Look at that color, isn't it beautiful?
That's right, Your use of the term, in your book on religion, you use a wonderful word which we religionists use all the time, or criticizers of religion, and that is the word numinous. And throughout that book, I was first motivated to read it partly because it seems to me to be written as much as a moral argument, and it needs to be read as part of a larger work.
Yeah.
So often now I think that that work has become metonymic for all your work, and I think that's terribly unfair because you have such a broader output than that. But I also was struck by the way in which it was really morally grounded, and you sort of placed yourself within a long tradition of moral critiques of religion. And in the same way, you also use words like marvelous and mystery and numinous in that book. Joseph Conrad's quote in one of the chapters, "The world of the living contains enough marvels and mysteries as it is, marvels and mysteries acting upon our emotions and intelligence in ways so inexplicable that it almost justifies the conception of life as an enchanted state. But no, I am too conscious of the marvelous to ever be fascinated by the supernatural." And then later with Ian McEwan, who's one of my favorite writers as well, he says, Ian McEwan can elucidate the numinous without conceding anything to the supernatural. Yes. So beautifully phrased, and I'm wondering if you could speak as a final note about what you mean by the numinous and how you think writers like McEwan do it so well.
Keats wrote a poem attacking, excuse me, John Keats wrote a poem attacking Isaac Newton for his gravitational theory, because he said it had unwoven the rainbow. It had taken the magic out of the rainbow. Now, in fact, there's another reason to agree with Byron about the Lakers and the general soppiness of the Romantic movement. Without Newton, you wouldn't have any idea of the beauty and variety of the spectrum and the various ways in which it can be replicated. None. So far from unweaving the rainbow, he makes the rainbow absolutely real to everybody. But when I say real, of course, I seem like a materialist. What I mean to say is that there's no question that innate in humans is a need for, one might as well say, the transcendent as the numinous, or perhaps venturesomely the ecstatic. And that though Verdi didn't believe in God, he could write a very beautiful requiem. Indeed, and no one would know the difference. We don't know that the devotional painters really believed. We only know what would have happened to them if they'd said they didn't believe. So this recourse to poetry, literature, music, love, things that can't be quantified but are essential, is the counterpart, I think, to the preferring of philosophy and literature over holy text and over incantation. Reciting a poem, which I did just manage to do without getting too throaty, is not at all the same as going to a ceremony several times a week or a day and chanting the same incantation all the time, in case if you didn't keep chanting it, like the children shouting that they believe in fairies, otherwise Tinkerbell will die. That if you stop incanting it, you might stop believing it. This is a pathetic way to live. You have all these opportunities for mental and aesthetic adventure, and you would exchange that for faith and for one book read in one way. I don't think so. If you take a page of Stephen Hawking on time, it's more beautiful than many a stained glass window, I would think. The Darwin on beetles alone, as he says, there is grandeur in this view of life, the amazing struggle, the amazing continuous life force that's involved in it. And the irony.
Giving one's life up for.
Yes.
Indeed.
I mean, as my great friend Lawrence Krauss says, a great fantastic physicist, probably the next Nobelist in physics, given a brilliant talk on the answer to the simple-minded question, why is there something not nothing? He said, everything comes from nothing. The quantum gives you something out of nothing all the time. There's a whole universe of nothing. But take heart, he said, everyone sitting here is made out of stardust. Isn't that magic enough for you? Every element of which you're composed is starry. Never mind Jesus of Nazareth. Stars had to die so you could sit here. Isn't that a bit more awe-inspiring than the burning bush?
On that note,
For
I'm
Christ's
afraid.
sake.
So,
Which is for peasants to gape at. So, I would say that saman is one of the great examples of how music, poetry, literature, conversation, irony, and the thing that makes it all possible, which is a certain amount of fortitude, moral and civic. Who would exchange that for a text at which you're only allowed to gaze in reverence?
we were just talking at lunch, and I'll end here, about the fortitude that it takes to create and display an archive and confront one's own history.
Congratulations to Emery for that.
And
let's hear that.
Absolutely.
Well done.
And the connection between an archive and love, I think, is a wonderful one to think about. And I'm reminded of Paula Cooey's novel, The Archivist, where one could say that the main character's archival work is motivated by a kind of love of the records. And her human love, her relationship, is in turn inspired by a kind of archival mystery of who the author is of a particular poetic text. And I love this novel for that very reason. And so I want to thank you for making the connection for us between the human archive and moral critique and love that you've done in your work. And because today the only subject is love, I want to thank you for your friendship to Salman Rushdie, who I'm quite sure could not have emerged into daylight, archive intact, without his friends. Thank you.
Well, love you too. Thanks.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.